Welcome to the deep dive. Pull up a chair. We've got some interesting source material today. It's an interview, actually, with two people who have totally different takes on something, well, something most of us see pretty often when we look up.
Right, and our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is to unpack their arguments. We want to pull out the key insights from what they said and help you get up to speed quickly on this ongoing mystery in the sky.
We are talking about those white trails that planes leave behind them. For a long time now, there's been this debate. Are they just normal contrails, the kind science explains?
Or are they something different, something people often call chemtrails?
Mhm.
And this interview we looked at really laid out those two sides very clearly.
It really did. It makes you pause and think, what are those lines exactly? So let's get into the claims and counterclaims from our source material. We want to understand the different viewpoints on what's supposedly happening up there.
Okay, let's break down this debate as it was presented. We heard from two people, Emma Larson, who argued for the chemtrail idea, and Dr. Michael Chen, offering the scientific explanation for contrails. They really presented fundamentally different interpretations of the exact same thing people see.
Let's start with Emma Larson's side, the chemtrail claim. The basic idea she put forward is that these trails aren't simply water vapor. The belief, as she explained it, is that they're, well, deliberate sprays. Chemicals released on purpose by governments or, other powerful groups. She even mentioned specific things allegedly being sprayed.
Right, she talked about things like aluminum and barium being key ingredients, allegedly, and even raised the possibility of biological agents being mixed in too, which is, a pretty big leap from just water vapor.
Definitely. And what about the why? The supposed purpose behind it all, according to her claims in the interview, that was a huge part of her perspective.
The alleged reasons are quite broad and pretty dramatic, actually. She mentioned things like large-scale weather control or modification, all the way to much darker theories about, say, population control or even mind manipulation. So in this view, the trails are tools for these bigger, hidden agendas.
Wow. Okay, so the composition and the intent were the big differences right away. Emma also talked about visual differences she saw compared to what she called normal contrails, like how they linger for hours spread out.
Yeah, she described them not dissipating quickly, but spreading into this sort of hazy, cloud-like film that eventually covers the whole sky.
And she specifically mentions seeing patterns like crisscrossing lines or grids that didn't look like normal flight paths to her. She even said she first noticed these patterns over Oregon. That really stood out to her.
Right, that specific observation point. And she didn't just rely on what she saw, she also brought up several kinds of evidence, as she put it, to back up these claims.
Okay, what were some of the key examples she gave?
Well, a major one, according to this perspective, involves soil and water samples. Proponents believe that tests they've done show really high, unnatural levels of elements, like aluminum and barium in places where there's a lot of this trail activity. They argue these levels can't just be normal background amounts.
And she mentioned patents too, didn't she? Something about a specific one.
Yes, the 1991 Wellsback patent. She presented this as proof that the technology actually exists for spraying reflective particles, maybe for climate control. The idea being that these operations are based on real, documented concepts.
Huh. And what about whistleblowers? That came up as well.
Whistleblower claims were definitely part of it. She mentioned former Air Force personnel, specifically naming someone, Kristen Megan. The claim was that this person had direct experience handling chemicals meant for aerial spraying, suggesting, that insiders have confirmed parts of these alleged programs.
And then there's the online aspect, which you'd kind of expect. She pointed to photos and videos shared online, right?
Exactly. On platforms like X or sites like Geoengineering Watch, these are presented as widespread visual proof of these unusual trails and their effects.
Okay, so we need to understand the thinking behind this belief system as she laid it out. It seemed tied to a feeling of distrust, right?
Absolutely. Emma really connected the belief in chemtrails to a fundamental distrust of governments and these sort of powerful, unseen groups.
A feeling that powerful entities are hiding things from the public. She even brought up historical examples from the source material, like MKultra, Tuskegee, Operation Northwoods, as past cases of government secrecy or deception. The argument being, if they did that, why couldn't they be doing this? That historical context is presented as a key reason for the belief.
Precisely. The idea that big secret operations have happened before makes it easier, in this view, to believe something like chemtrails could be happening now. She also linked seeing these trails to personal health issues like breathing problems or fatigue, suggesting a direct cause and effect.
And how did she address the secrecy aspect? How could something so huge be kept quiet?
She suggested maybe like the Manhattan Project, it could be highly compartmentalized, people only knowing their small part, or maybe even automated systems are involved, limiting the number of people who know the full picture.
Okay, so that paints a pretty clear picture of the chemtrail perspective from Emma Larson based on the source. Now, let's completely switch gears. Let's look at the other side presented by Dr. Michael Chen, the standard scientific explanation for contrails. How does he define them?
Well, he gave the straightforward scientific definition. Contrails, condensation trails form when hot, human exhaust from jet engines hits the very cold, often humid air at high altitudes. We're talking typically above, say, 26,000 feet. The water vapor in the exhaust cools rapidly and freezes, forming tiny ice crystals. It's basically like creating a thin, temporary cloud. That's the fundamental science of how they form.
And he was really clear about what they're made of, right? Directly countering the chemical claims.
Oh, absolutely. He stated very clearly that contrails are not chemicals. They are overwhelmingly just ice crystals. Yes, there are trace amounts of combustion byproducts from the jet fuel, but nothing like the heavy metals or biological agents that are alleged in the chemtrail theory.
Okay, so if they're just ice crystals, how does the scientific view, as Dr. Chen explained it, account for those observations Emma Larson mentioned? The lingering trails, the spreading, the grid patterns, those visuals are pretty central to the chemtrail idea.
Right, and science offers explanations for those. He explained that trails lingering for a long time isn't proof of chemicals. It happens naturally when the air up there is sufficiently cold and humid. If the conditions are right, these ice crystal clouds can persist and spread out, just like natural high-altitude cirrus clouds do.
Ah, so it's the atmospheric conditions dictating how long they last, not necessarily what's in them. Makes sense. What about the grid patterns?
Dr. Chen explained those as a pretty straightforward result of air traffic. Planes fly along established routes, like highways in the sky, right? So when you have multiple planes using these corridors, especially near airports or major intersections, their contrails naturally overlap and intersect. Then winds at altitude can spread and shift these lines over time, creating patterns that might look like grids. It's just air traffic and weather dynamics.
Okay. And he also directly pushed back on the evidence cited for chemtrails. What was his take on those soil and water tests?
He argued that those kinds of tests often lack proper scientific controls, and crucially, that the results often misinterpret the natural background levels of elements like aluminum and barium. These elements are actually very common in soil and dust naturally. He also mentioned that major studies by bodies like the EPA and independent researchers have specifically looked for evidence of widespread chemical spraying and haven't found it. That's the scientific counterpoint there.
And the patents, like that Wellsback patent she brought up as proof?
Dr. Chen's point was that patents like that are usually for theoretical concepts, maybe ideas for future technologies, often related to geoengineering proposals like managing solar radiation. He really stressed that having a patent for an idea doesn't mean there's a secret operational program actually using it. It's just an idea on paper, not proof of deployment.
Got it. Patent doesn't equal active program. What about the whistleblower claims, like the specific person mentioned?
From the scientific perspective he presented, the issue is that these claims often lack concrete, verifiable proof. Things like specific flight logs, dates, times, chemical, manifest the kind of documentation needed to actually substantiate such serious allegations under scrutiny. Without that hard data, they remain anecdotal.
He also mentioned HARP briefly, because that sometimes gets tangled up in these theories. What did he say about that?
Yeah, he clarified HARP is a research facility. It's designed specifically to study the Earth's ionosphere, a layer high up in the atmosphere. He was quite clear that based on its known equipment and purpose, it simply doesn't have the capability to control weather or spray chemicals.
Maybe the strongest scientific argument against a secret chemtrail program, the one Dr. Chen highlighted, was just the sheer scale involved.
Absolutely. He emphasized the scientific consensus on this. If you actually wanted to spray enough material to affect weather or populations over large areas, it would require an absolutely enormous operation. Thousands of planes, massive logistical support for storing and loading chemicals, and, maybe most importantly, you'd need millions of people involved, pilots, ground crews, manufacturers, air traffic controllers, government people, all keeping quiet. Scientists generally see keeping something that vast secret as logistically implausible. That's a really key point from the scientific side.
He also tackled the health claims. Emma Larson mentioned the idea that trails cause respiratory issues or fatigue.
Yes, and on this, the science is pretty firm, according to Dr. Chen. He stated there's no credible scientific evidence directly linking contrails themselves to these kinds of health problems. He repeated that contrails are mainly ice crystals formed very high up. They mostly dissipate up there or fall as precipitation that doesn't reach the ground in concentrations likely to cause widespread illness.
So where does science point for those kinds of health issues then?
Well, he emphasized that things like respiratory problems and fatigue are much more clearly linked to known ground-level pollution stuff from cars, factories, and so on, things we can actually measure down here. He made the point that seeing trails and feeling sick might be a correlation, but in science, correlation doesn't equal causation. You need proof of a mechanism. And he noted that posts on platforms like X, while reflecting personal experiences, don't usually have the scientific rigor needed to establish that kind of causal link.
Which kind of brings us to the role the internet plays in all this, something Dr. Chen also discussed.
Right. It's definitely a double-edged sword. The internet lets people share observations and concerns really easily, which is powerful. But, according to Dr. Chen, it also allows misinformation to spread very quickly and widely. He suggested many photos shared online might just be misidentifying normal contrails under unusual lighting or weather or other atmospheric phenomena.
And he talked about echo chambers.
Yes, the phenomenon where online groups focused on a specific belief, like chemtrails, can end up reinforcing that belief internally. Information that confirms the belief gets amplified, while contradictory evidence, like scientific explanations, might get ignored, dismissed, or reinterpreted through that lens of distrust. It makes it hard for scientific consensus to get through sometimes.
All of this seems to lead back to the scientific consensus view, which Dr. Chen really emphasized.
Exactly. And he cited a specific study, one published in Environmental Research Letters back in 2016. They surveyed 77 leading atmospheric scientists, real experts in clouds and atmospheric chemistry. And the result was pretty striking. None of them reported seeing evidence indicating a secret, large-scale atmospheric spraying program. He also pointed out that major organizations like NASA, NOAA, and universities consistently state that contrails are a well-understood phenomenon based on water vapor and physics. That's the established scientific view.
And finally, how did Dr. Chen talk about trust from the scientific perspective, especially compared to the distrust that seemed to fuel the other viewpoint?
He explained that science works based on evidence that's testable, verifiable, and can be checked by others independently. Contrails, he said, have been studied for decades and are explained by known physics. He encouraged people wanting reliable information to look at primary sources, peer-reviewed studies, reports from NASA or the EPA, rather than just forums or unverified social media claims, and suggested focusing concern on known environmental issues, like ground-level pollution, where the scientific evidence of harm is clear.
Okay, so if we try to bring this all together, synthesizing the information from the source interview, from Emma Larson's perspective and Dr. Michael Chen's, what's the fundamental disconnect here?
It really seems to come down to two completely different ways of looking at the same thing in the sky. On one side, represented by Emma Larson, you've got personal observation of something that looks unusual, combined with a deep distrust based on historical events, worries about health, and a belief in hidden motives. This leads to the conclusion that it must be chemicals being sprayed.
And then on the other side, from Dr. Chen, you have the established scientific understanding. Explanations rooted in physics, chemistry, meteorology for why contrails form, why they look different sometimes based on atmospheric conditions. This view relies on testable data, peer review, and points at the huge logistical hurdles for the kind of secret program alleged.
Yeah, and the source material really highlighted how the internet plays into this. It lets people share those personal observations and build communities around